What's up everyone, welcome to Workshop Rebuild. This is my channel where I take apart, clean and reassemble machines to make them fully functional again. I finally received the rebuild kit for the Kohler KT17 Series 2, so without further ado, let's get to the video. I set up this table right in front of me here so you guys will have a perfect view on the engine rebuild. Over there on my right I have some tools I'll be using today. I have some products that I'll be using for the engine rebuild. Right in the middle here I have most of the engine parts. Some I'll be adding as the engine gets assembled. And over here on the right I have the engine rebuild kit. So without further ado, let's dig into the parts. In the middle of the table over here I have both halves of the housing. I have the crankshaft in front of me. I have the connecting rods, I have the gears, which are the oil pump and the governor, and over here I have both cylinders and then a front cover for the PTO. I'll give you guys an in-depth view on that. And over here I have some assembly grease, I have just normal grease, I have an extra tube of RTV sealant right here, and this one right here is from Loctite, but it doesn't matter which brand. I have some paint thinner to clean up some surfaces. Right here I have some pipe joint thread lock for the oil plug and the oil drain plug right here. Over here I have some blue Loctite. This is just for some screws internally. And that's about it for the product. So moving on to the special tools that I'll be using for today are two different sizes of torque wrenches. One torque wrench is from 20 to 100 Newton meter and the other one is from 1 to 20 Newton meter. So we have a different variation of torques on some of these bolts over here, and I'll leave a link down below for the torque specs and where you guys can find a spec sheet. And then some other miscellaneous tools, and if you guys will, I also have a feeler gauge right here just to double check some clearances and some tolerances on the engine themselves. But I won't go too much into detail on the sizes of this engine. Everything will be in the link down below, and I hope you guys can measure that yourself. This is just purely an assembly video right here. If you guys have any questions for measurements, just leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Over here on the far left I have the rebuild kit which I received from iSafe Tractors. I had a little issue right here. I ordered a kit on eBay which was a complete kit with the connecting rods right here. Even though the old ones are still good, I found a kit on eBay that had everything, but there was some issues due to delivery and all that, so I got my money refunded and I went with the piston kit from iSafe Tractors, and I went with the full gasket kit which includes the front and rear seal right here. So I'm going to be installing the pistons as well, so I'll give you guys a close-up on the piston ring assembly as well. So let me dig into the main block first and we'll get that assembled. I will be focusing on this half of the engine block first. This half has the oil inlet on the top and the governor lever as well right over here. The first thing I will be doing is adding an oil plug to the back end of it, and that lies on this side right here. It is the simple oil plug right here and it gets inserted right here. Before I thread this in, I will add just a little bit of this gray pipe joint compound to that oil plug just to make sure that it doesn't leak. The next step I will be taking on this part of the engine block is adding the oil pickup, which consists of a little tube, a bolt which holds a bracket, and this will hold this pipe in place. This oil pickup right here, which has a screen, and a bore on this side, which this pipe can lead into. This right here lies on the very bottom of the block and is held in place by this spring plate right here. So let's get this installed. First up, I'm gonna grab the pipe right here and install it like this. Turn it 90 degrees so the bend goes a little bit up. Push it into place, and it should look something like that. Next up, I'm going to install the oil pickup chamber right here. This bore aligns to the pipe that we installed before, just like this. This pickup chamber does stick out just that far and will also sit on the other side of the housing. So that's correct that way. I just finished installing the oil pickup chamber, oil pickup tube, and the plate. I found it easier to install the plate first, bend it up, and then install the chamber. That was a much easier way of doing that. Now I can install this plate and little bolt that hold down the oil pickup tube. And this gets installed right down here, and the bent side actually touches the pickup tube itself. The last video I did on this Kohler engine, I shared the differences between the Kohler KT17 Series 1 and the Kohler KT17 Series 2. On YouTube and Facebook, many of you commented some differences and some issues about the pressure and had questions about the oil pump, if it was internal or external. And I'll go over that right now very quickly because the engine blocks are exactly the same internally. There's no difference internally on the KT17 Series 1 or 2. So I'll give you guys an animation of the Series 1 and 2 of how this gets internally lubricated. So let's get to that right now. This right here is the KT17 Series 2, and I'll show you guys the flow of lubrication through this right here, and then I'll show you an animation of the Series 1 after this. So the oil pickup is right here. The oil transfers through this tube right here and gets sucked in by this little pump right here, which lies on the side of the engine. It is an internal pump, and on the Series 1 and 2 they both have the exact same pump. The dimensions are exactly the same and everything else. Even the channels where the oil flows through are exactly the same. After the oil goes through the oil pump, it is then transferred to this main bearing right here, which lubricates the first main bearing. An upgrade on the Kohler KT Series 2 was that the crankshaft was cross-drilled. What that means is it was drilled from here to the main bearing. And the oil pump doesn't have to be very strong if this engine is turning. So what I mean by that is, as this engine turns like this, you guys can understand if there's oil right here and this turns at an idle speed of 1200 RPM or a max speed of 3600 RPM, we're going to have very, very high centrifugal force right here from here to here. So if there's any lubrication or any oil in this passageway, it will make its way out through this bore right here because it just gets pulled out by that centrifugal force. So the oil pump itself doesn't even have to be that strong because it will get pulled out of this bore right here where the connecting rod sits. So the oil ends up right here, and after it lubricates the connecting rod bearing, it will then splash back down where the oil reservoir is, which is the bottom part of the engine. After the oil gets transferred to this bearing, there's another bore that leads all the way up to the first bearing of the camshaft. The camshaft right here is drilled all the way through, and the oil leads to this bearing right here, follows down this gallery right here, and ends up in the second bearing right here and lubricates the second bearing. The same thing happens with this bearing. The oil gets trapped right here, but then with that centrifugal force, it pulls oil onto the journal for the connecting rod right here. So we have another cross bore from here to this bearing. The KT17 Series 1, we have the exact same setup as it is in this engine, just two parts are different. We have the crankshaft that is dimensionally exactly the same, but it is not cross drilled or cross bored. And the camshaft up top on the KT17 Series 1 has two little bores on either side of this camshaft right here, which then drop oil onto these journals right here. The oil gets picked up through the tube, it goes into the oil pump right here, it gets pressurized, and the lubrication hits the main bearing right here. The crankshaft is not cross drilled, so the oil does not flow to here. The oil will just work its way out and then back into the reservoir down here. The oil still transfers up into the camshaft through this bore right here, and since there are two little holes on the camshaft on the Series 1 right here, they trickle oil down and out onto these two journals, but it didn't do it very sufficiently since these bores right here were very, very small, and the chance that it hit these journals and lubricated it enough was very, very small. Another feature that I saw that the KT Series 1 had was a plug here at the end. So what that meant is it didn't actually even allow any oil in this gallery right here to end up on the second bearing. So that's why most of the KT17 Series 1 engines had a failure on the second bearing right here. And as well, the crankshaft was not cross drilled right here, so even if any oil would reach this area right here, it would never come out to the second journal right here. I just shared with you guys the differences between the Series 1 and 2 very, very quickly, but I'll leave a card up above so you guys can click that and watch my previous video. So without further ado, let's get back to the rebuild. Next up, I will be installing the oil pump right here. The designated location for the oil pump is on the face of the engine block right here, and this is where it will get inserted. For the oil pump, we will also be needing the drive gear right here. This one on the KT17 Series 2 is a certain plastic. On the KT17 Series 1, this was metal, but this one is still in good condition, so I'll be reusing this. We have the shaft, which drives the oil pump right here, like this, which drives the oil pump right here. We have a shim, which is very important, and then we also have a little spring pin which gets inserted. This right here is the oil pump assembly, which I'll be installing right here, and after that I'll be installing the cover which goes over the oil pump, and that will be it. So let's get to that. Everything that I install around the oil pump, I will add some grease to it, and this grease right here is an assembly grease. What this is actually grease, and as the temperature rises it will actually just disintegrate. So I'm going to add a little bit of this grease on here just to make sure everything is lubricated. Just like that. So now the sequence of the assembly is that I'm going to add the gear first. I'm going to add some grease right here in this bore, like so, making sure that this cutout is facing the chamber, like that. And now what I will do as well is grab my shim that I need and install it right beside it. I have a punch ready, so I'm just going to align that shim right there so the shaft will actually follow through. And just like that, the shaft is through to the other side, and now this assembly will hold. To actually make sure that this is in place, I'm gonna have to add the pin right here. Before I install the spring pin right here, I'm just gonna grab a wire and feed that right through there and make sure the shaft is aligned to the gear right here. Now I can be sure that everything is in place and I can insert the spring pin. Next up on this half of the housing, I'll be installing the governor, which is positioned on the very top right here. As you guys can see over here, there is a locating pin, and we have our governor lever right here. So to install this gear right here, I'm gonna have to open up this lever right here like that, and then add some grease and mount that this way and make sure it spins freely. And now what I can do is activate that lever to the governor just like that. I'm gonna add some grease on that as well, just a little blob right here, just that that's lubricated right there. On the back end of the housing, I will insert this set screw right here, and it is threaded as well. We have a copper washer as a sealing unit, but I will add some UTV sealant along this thread just to make sure it doesn't leak. And this right here is next to the dipstick housing. The crankshaft looks amazing and it turns freely, as you guys can see right here. I do not hear anything that's abnormal. Everything is perfect right here. So I can tilt these connecting rods to the back and I can look forward to install the camshaft right here. What's important to do when you install the camshaft to the connecting rod is to make sure the timing is aligned. Right here on the camshaft we have a little hole, and on the crankshaft on this side we have a mark which is right here. To install the camshaft and crankshaft and make sure that they're timed right, we're going to have to make sure that this hole aligns with that little tab right there on the crankshaft. Before I align the camshaft to the crankshaft and insert it to the designated bearings right here, I'm going to grease these up as well. So I greased up these areas right here where our camshaft will be sitting on this diameter right here and this diameter right here in the journals. And now I can install the valve lifter themselves, which are located underneath the camshaft right here. Another thing I will be doing before I install these is greasing them up as well. Before moving on to the other half of the housing, I just went ahead and greased up all the gears in line here and every lobe on the camshaft as well, and it turns smooth, so I'm very happy with that. And now I can really just move on to the other half of the housing. I brought the second housing right here, and there's not much that we have to do to it, but there are just two little things. I have to install this extra oil drain plug right here that probably John Deere made themselves. This I will be inserting on the bottom right here, and for that I'm going to use the gray pipe joint compound again, and I'm just going to make sure that that's nicely coated so when I install it, it won't leak in the future. And just like that, it's really snug in there, and that compound will dry and harden as well to give it an extra sealant. So next up, what I have to do on this side of the housing is install these valve lifters right here, and they are located on the top half as well, right here and right here. I will be greasing them up that they move freely, but one thing that I have to do is when I install them, on the back end of them right here, I'm going to have to put a little bit of tape on them right here. Just going to have to grab a little piece of tape right here and tape it around right there, so that valve, so that lifter right there won't fall out as I place this part on top of the other part of the housing. Next up, I can move on to the front cover, which is on the side of the drive shaft. What I'll have to do first is install one of the seals that came with the rebuild kit from iSafe Tractors. And after I install the seal right here, I can go to the back end of the cover and apply a bead of UTV sealant around the perimeter right here. So as I install this, it will give a proper adhesion and it will not leak any oil, especially on the bottom end of this cover. For that, I'm going to be needing 9 bolts. Not to forget, I'm going to have to install the valve right here, which consists of a ball bearing and a spring, which is located right here. But I'll give you guys a close-up on that. So without further ado, let's install the seal and the bolts. Over there on the hand press, I was able to push in the seal flush with the face of this housing right here. And now I can flip it over, clean off this surface right here and over here, and then I can apply the UTV sealant. Just finished installing the front cover over here. The front seal went on very smooth. You got to make sure that that lip with the spring doesn't fall out of place, or else your seal will not seat properly around this main shaft. But everything went on super smooth, and I did seal off this front cover with the RTV sealant. But after I installed it and tightened all the bolts down, I noticed that the iSafe Tractors kit actually comes with the gasket here. The only function this front cover has is to keep oil in, as well as with that seal. So you can go with the gasket or the RTV sealant. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing too serious behind that cover. But with that being said, I'm going to move on to the cylinders right in front of me here, and I'm going to be installing the valves, and later on I'm going to be working on the pistons and piston rings. So let's get to that. On the table, I have a couple tools laid out and both cylinders that I'll be working on. One cylinder already has the valves installed, as you guys can see, intake and exhaust over here, and I'll go through the procedure on how to install them if you don't have the proper tool like a spring compressor. These are the tools right in front of me that I'll be using. I have 2 nuts right here that I'll be using. They are both the same size. I believe these are 1/2-inch nuts right here, or possibly 7/16. I have a smaller flathead screwdriver, a little bit larger and thicker flathead screwdriver, a tiny pry bar, and some needle nose pliers. Off to the right over here is the cylinder, which I will be installing the valves in. And I have 2 valves right here, 2 springs, 2 retainer caps, and 2 for the top as well. I have this seal that came in the iSafe Tractors kit. This one will go on the intake valve, and I have for each valve 2 keepers right here. So let's dig into the valve assembly. So the first thing I'll be doing is taking the exhaust valve, and we'll be working on this side right here first. Before I insert the valve, I'm going to add some grease on the valve stem itself, and I'm going to slowly push this in and make sure it's all lubed up. Now what I can do, I can take my assembly right here, the spring retainer, the spring, and the top spring retainer right here, and I'm going to lube up the areas where each part touches each other, and the bottom and top as well, and then I can insert this into place. And just like that, I'm gonna slide it into place with the retainer ring down, and then compress the top end and just gently push it down, and like that. And next up, what I'm going to do is grab my little pry bar and a flathead screwdriver to grab the front end of the spring, which is actually the retainer cap. As you guys can see, the spring is in line, and I have both nuts, one on the right and on the left, so the spring is compressed. And now what I can do is push the valve in, just like that. I don't know if you guys saw that, but the valve is right here, the end. And now, with that being open enough, I can now add these two keepers. Now I can add both keepers to the valve stem, and before I add them, I'm going to just take an all-purpose grease and apply a lot of grease on the inside and the same amount on the outside. Now I'm going to be using the small flathead screwdriver, just merging it to the keeper, assisting it down there, and making sure it's seated properly. Once it's seated properly, I can then just turn it over gently in place that I have enough room to add the second keeper. And now with that in place, I can take my small pry bar and push on the front face of the valve. That will drop both nuts. I can bring them to the side. And then release the spring. I just finished the valve assembly. Hopefully you guys learned something there, especially with those spacer and nuts. If you don't have the spring compressor, you can just do it this way. It's not the best way, but it does get the job done. Now I can move on to the piston and piston rings. I'll show you guys how that goes. Moving on to the piston assembly for the cylinders, I have the piston, I have a wrist pin, 2 snap rings. We have these 3 rings in line that are for the 3rd groove. We have a middle ring right here, and we have another compression ring on the top. According to this set right here that I received from iSafe Tractors, there are 3 different styles right here indicated on their instructions. We will be working today with the 3rd style right here because there's only 1 ring, which is the top ring, that has a bevel on it. This is the compression ring. The 2nd ring is rectangular, and then the 3rd ring right here is for the oil, and it consists of 3 parts. So one of these thin ones goes on the bottom, this one right here goes in the middle, and another thin one goes above that. I'll share with you guys how I install these rings and make sure that the gaps are according to the spec, and then we'll be able to put them on the piston and push them into the cylinders. I have the first ring in front of me here, and I'll be installing it into the cylinder and checking the gap. For that, I'll be using my feeler gauge, and the gap that this first ring will need and the second ring is from 10 thou to 20 thou. So that's for the first ring and the second compression ring. To make sure that the ring goes in properly and the whole circumference of the ring is at the right depth, I'm going to be using a depth gauge right here. Most people will use the piston, but I don't like using the piston because when you put it in on the top, the piston is never the same size as the bore. The top of a piston is always machined smaller than the bottom end because it receives more heat. And the bottom end, as you guys can see, is not straight or flush, so I cannot use the piston in my case. And some people may do that, but I just really don't like doing that. So I'm going to take the ring right here and gently place it in there. And now when it's at a certain depth, I'm going to take my gauge. So what I do is grab the first depth and then just go around the perimeter of the ring and make sure it's touching everywhere. And just like that, I know it's set properly. Now I can take my feeler gauge, and the gap should be between 10 and 20. I believe it's not enough yet, and yeah, I might have to go a little bit smaller just that I can get a measurement. And the gap is just under 2 thou. So what that means, if I want to hit 10 thou, I'm going to have to take this ring to the vise and just file off one of the sides. And after I'm done filing the profile, I'm going to just chamfer the ends, and hopefully we'll get as close as possible to 10 thou, so we have the smallest gap on this top ring. I have these two pieces of plywood set up that I don't damage the surface of the piston ring. Now I'm going to install it just on one side and making sure that the angle is towards the center of this piston ring, and that's the way I want to file it. I don't want to file it just flat. I want to file it towards the center of this diameter right here. Just like that, nothing too serious. I'm going to take a flat file and just file it very slowly. And I got to make sure, since this one doesn't fit, I'm going to have to go at least 10 thou down, which will give me a 10 thou gap. So just making sure that I have that gap, go and test it, come back, file it, test it, file it, and so on until you reach the designated measurement. I'm going to go test it, but before I test it, I want to make a chamfer on all four sides. Just like that, I'm going to go test it. Before I install the piston into the cylinder, I gotta know on which side the flywheel is. I indicated the flywheel up here with a piece of tape to my right, and the piston right here has the flywheel indicator on it as well, which is facing this way. So eventually my piston will have to go in just like this. Before I install anything, I have to make sure the cylinder is perfectly clean and to size, which it is, and the piston has no burrs on it, and the rings are in perfect condition. I finished installing the piston in the cylinder, and now I can mount the cylinder to the engine block. have the cylinder ready and the piston is pushed all the way to the back, so I will be able to install the wrist pin right here, and after I install the wrist pin I can install both snap rings on either side of this wrist pin. After that, I'm going to turn the engine over by hand and mount the cylinder to the engine block. I finished assembling the pistons in the cylinders and I finally mounted them to the main block, so that's all secured, and now I can move on to the cylinder heads and I'll show you how to tighten the bolts and insert the head gaskets. This right here is the head gasket from the iSave Tractors gasket kit, and there is a right and a wrong way to install this. When you look at this gasket, it was pressed from one side. So one side, which is the back side, is perfectly flush, and the front side, you can identify the edges which are rounded off, and this will be your outside, and or it will be touching your head. The flat side will be touching your cylinder. So what I'm going to do before I install the head gasket and the head, I'm going to degrease all the surfaces right here with the paint thinner I have, and on the cylinder heads as well. So I'm going to get ready with the cylinder head, and I'm going to put one bolt already through on the top and another one closer to the bottom, just like that. And what I'll do is get my gasket ready and locate it on these two bolts that I just installed. And now, as I come up against the head, I'll slowly start turning them in. Next up, I'll be installing the valve covers, and in our gasket kit we have 3 new gaskets that we'll be installing as well, so let's dig into it. Right in front of me I have most of the engine already assembled. The heads are on, the cylinders, the valves, the pistons are in. The main block is more or less complete. I added the stator and the flywheel, and now I can move on to the intake manifold and exhaust manifolds, and later on I'll be moving on to the PTO clutch on the other side of the flywheel. So let's get to that. I finished mounting the intake manifold and the exhaust manifolds, and now I can move on to the points and I'll show you how to adjust the clearance on that. So let's get to it. And I'm going to grab my flathead screwdriver and slowly turn this bolt in. Before I tighten it, I'm going to add the second one. Just like that. I want to make sure that it's going to be in the middle, like that. And now I can slowly start tightening it. Next up, I'll be turning over the engine by hand, and when you're looking at the flywheel, you'll be turning it in a clockwise rotation. As I turn it, I'll give you guys a close-up on the points themselves. In this position right here, they're open, and you'll be able to see the points open and close. That's closed right there, and it's going to open here in a bit. It's going up, and now that's in the up position right there. Now what we do is we grab our feeler gauge and set it to 20 thou. The fine adjustment of 20 thou will be plus minus 3 thou. So you can go to 0.023 or minus 3 thou, which is 0.017. Loosen up the flathead screw right here. That's going to release the tension on the spring right here, as you can see. Now I'm going to insert my feeler gauge between both points. I'm going to squeeze on it and slowly tighten that flathead screwdriver. Just like that. Tighten it up even more. I'm going to turn the engine 1 revolution to open the gap of the points again, like that, and double check it with the feeler gauge, and it seems like it's good. So I'm going to wrap up this video right here on the Kohler KT17. I just featured the whole engine rebuild as an assembly video. I didn't really go into detail on the measuring side or the wiring side or function side of the engine and what all the parts do, but I hope I showed you guys really how to assemble it and I gave you guys an in-depth view as well. If you guys like this video, please leave a like down below, subscribe to my channel, and as always, stay tuned because in part 10, we're going to have this on the engine stand to get it running for the first time.